A couple of weeks ago, we started a series on King David of Israel, and we've been learning a bunch of different things about King David. It's been an interesting study, just going through his life. He's one of the most well-documented figures in the Bible. So there's a lot of material, a lot of things about King David that we could talk about, and lots of information. And one of the things that we learned is that David was called and considered a man after God's own heart, which means that he sought the Lord in all things. He followed God and trusted Him with his heart, soul, mind, and his strength. But we also learned that David is not perfect. In fact, far from it. And we're going to even get to more things about that today and in the weeks to come. But just last week, we learned how David was set on really unwarranted bloodshed. He was out to kill a whole bunch of people, really for a slight, just an insult. And he was out to kill a whole lot of people because of this. But he was turned around by a courageous woman who was willing to speak wisdom to him, and he listened. And so he turned around. But through everything in David's life, from the small things of keeping the sheep to the big things of killing a giant, and everything in between, God has been preparing David for a time when he would be king over Israel. And we're actually going to get to that time today. As we learned last week, David had a band of about 600 men that he went around with, moving from place to place, and they were trying to do good in Israel. They were protecting shearers from bandits and things like that. They were out there trying to do good, and really also trying to stay one step ahead of King Saul, who was trying to kill David and probably really all the rest of them. But during this time, David did something desperate and strange. Something very desperate and strange. He and his men, along with their families, they went to live among the Philistines. Yes, the Philistines. And yet, for those of you that are kind of following along, yes, Goliath, the one that he killed, was a Philistine. And yes, when David went walking back through towns after the battle, they were singing about how David had killed his tens of thousands of Philistines. He went to go live, yes, with those Philistines. And we're going to pick up in 1 Samuel 27, we're going to read first 4 verses. This kind of gives you an idea of what's going on in David, in his head and his heart. David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish of Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. This was a pretty dark time for David. Just the words he says there at the beginning, that I'm going to perish at the hands of Saul one day. There's nothing better for me to do. There's nothing else I can do except just leave Israel and go to the Philistines. But it was a time that he seemed to turn away from God. Turn away from God's plan that he had for him. I mean, think about it. This is David, the Israelite hero who had killed Goliath and who knows how many Philistines. And now he was going to the Philistine king for protection. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Why didn't this king just kill David as soon as he showed up? I mean, that would make a lot more sense to me, that if, you killed a bunch of us and you come show up at our doorstep and you're looking for protection, I mean, why not just kill him outright? But the only thing that kind of makes sense is that King Achish must have thought that he could use David to his advantage over his old enemy Saul. So that must be the only thing. That's the only thing that kind of makes sense to me. But the deeper issue here, though, is that David had no business in Gath. He had no business there. He had no business living among the pagan Philistines. That's not where he belonged. And he had no business attaching himself to this ungodly king, which is what he was doing. David was supposed to be the king of Israel, already been anointed by Samuel as king of Israel. Yes, he had not ascended to the throne yet. He did not have a crown on his head, but God had already set him apart to be the king of Israel. He was supposed to be committed to God, supposed to be committed to him, and that is where his trust should have been. His trust should have been in God, not in some pagan king. But where do we see him turning? At a dark time in his life. The ironic thing is that while King Achish trusted David, which as you read through the scripture, you see that Achish actually trusted David. He liked having him there. He was glad to have him there. But the rest of the Philistine leaders did not. They did not trust him at all. In fact, maybe they were a little bit more perceptive than the king was, because David really was not to be trusted. But David never really belonged there, because he never really fit in with the rest. He never belonged there, because they knew that David was not a Philistine. They knew that he didn't belong with them. And so he was just kind of drifting. And that's what happens when we put our trust in worldly things and worldly people. When we rest our trust in those things, we just kind of drift in life. And we drift further and further away from God. And that's what's going on with David here. Sometime later, though, we're not reading all of this, but sometime later, the Philistines went to war again against Israel. This is an off and on again kind of thing. It's kind of a constant that sometimes they're in battle, sometimes they're fighting, sometimes they're not. But the Philistine lords would not let David go with him, because that's what the king wanted. The king wanted David to ride right along with him, to be his bodyguard, to go with him into battle. And the Philistine lords said, no, we don't trust him, we can't do that. So David and his men, they headed back home. By the time they got home, though, David and his men found that some Amalekites, there's a lot of ites around. This is one kind of ite. These were the Amalekites. The Amalekites had come into their town and they had burned it to the ground. They had taken all of their sheep and all of their herds, and they had taken all their families, their wives, their children, taken all of them, and they had put them like in a mule train, and they took them off. They didn't kill them. They just took them captive and left with them and led them away. And David's men, when they came back, they became so angry with David. They became so angry with him that they wanted to stone him on the spot. They were talking about it. This is their leader. This is the guy that killed the giant. This is the guy who they've been following. They were talking about, whispering among themselves, we just need to kill this guy. He has clearly gone off the reservation. He clearly does not understand what's going on. He has led us into this place, and now our families are gone. They've been taken, and so they wanted to just kill him, because they were placing all the blame on him, and which was a good place to put it. But it was at this moment of crisis when David literally had nobody else he could turn to. Not a single person. He had been rejected by the Philistines. He had been rejected by Saul and by the armies of Israel. He had even been rejected by his own men now at this point, that he was in such a low spot that he had no place to turn, that he finally turned back to God. And we're going to read about this in 1 Samuel 30. We're going to read verses 6 through 8, if you want to find that over there. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? He answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. So David went out after the Amalekites, after the people that had stolen his family and the families of all of his men. The good news is, or the great news is, that although David had turned his back on God, God never turned his back on David. And that's a wonderful lesson that we all need to learn. That even when we push God away, even when we put God at arm's length, God does not turn away from us. God still loves us. God still cares. God still wants to be in our lives. He wants to be the most important thing in our lives. And when David turned back to God, he didn't have to go searching for God. God was right there. And that's a great thing. God never turned his back on him. So he and his men went out, fought the Amalekites, and got their families back. Now, it just so happens that as you remember, the Israelites were going to fight the Philistines. As this was going on and David and his men were fighting and defeating the Amalekites, Saul and his armies were fighting against those Philistines. And whereas David's battle went very well for him and they got everybody back, Saul's battle went very badly. Went very, very badly. In fact, the army of Israel was overrun. Jonathan, who was David's best friend, the son of the king, was killed. And Saul himself took a mortal wound. But instead of allowing himself to be captured by the Philistines and tortured to death, which is surely what would have happened, he fell on his own sword and he died. Well, that sounds like really good news for David. That sounds like really great news because now Saul's not alive anymore. Saul can't go go and chase him down and try to kill him. That enemy is gone. You would think that David at this point would be ecstatic because now that pressure is lifted from him and now he can go and he can be king like he's supposed to be. But that's not what happened. David was actually very sad and he lamented over Saul and Jonathan. If you want to read about that, it's in 2 Samuel chapter 1. I'm not going to read it to you, but you're welcome to read it. And he commanded in this song, where he sang the song about Jonathan and Saul, and he commanded that all of Judah be taught this song, that they could all sing it. That doesn't sound like someone who was really against somebody, does it? But that's the heart of David. Now, again, at a loss, David again inquired of the Lord. He went back to God again about what he should do. Because now here he is. He's still in this pagan land, but he had turned back to God. God had blessed him, allowed him to get his families back, but now he hears this news about Saul, who's gone, who's dead. And so David now is saying, well, is this the time? God, is this it? I've been waiting for a long time to be king. You've told me that I'm going to be king for a long time. Is this the time? So he inquires of God again, and God told him to go up to a place called Hebron, where he would be anointed and accepted as the king of Judah. But David was not yet accepted as king of Israel as a whole. Because Saul's son Ishbosheth, how would you like to have that as your name to write on your papers for school and things like that, Ishbosheth, they made him king of Israel because he was Saul's son. So now what we've got is a divided kingdom. That's a problem. Anytime there's a divided kingdom, that's not a good thing. Anytime we're divided in our own lives, in our own families, that's an ugly time. It's a bad time. And so now you can imagine that there were some really tense times here. You can imagine that there was some fighting and that there was a whole lot of intrigue. And there certainly was. And you can read all about that. But one day, two of Ishbosheth's own men plotted and murdered him as he was taking his afternoon nap. Not a very great way for a king to go out. But that's what happened, and not long after that, the tribes of Israel came together, and they came to David at Hebron, and we're going to pick up with that in chapter 5, and read verses 1 through 5. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. So David was finally king over all of Israel. All this time, he had been waiting, fighting battles, running from Saul. All this time, he had finally been given what he was promised by God so many years ago. It had finally come to pass. And David's first act as king was to go and to do two things. He went and he took the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites and set it up as his capital city. And then he also went to war against the Philistines and ran them out of the territory of Israel. And here in verse 10, we're going to read one more thing. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. So now over the course of his reign, God blessed David. Over and over again, God blessed David. He expanded Israel's territory from about 6,000 square miles to over 60,000 square miles. That's a huge improvement. That's a huge overtaking of land and things like that. So David is finally king after all of this time, years after he was anointed in his father's house by Samuel, years after all of that, through times of faithfulness, through times of failure. God remained faithful throughout and brought David to this place where he became king. So what can we learn? What can we learn from this lesson? What lesson can we learn that's applicable to us from David, who's running around in Philistine territory and being crowned a king? What can we possibly learn from something like that? Even though kingship is probably not in your future. I'm sorry, Peyton. It's not going to happen. Kingship is probably not in your future. But there are some things that we can learn here, especially for you graduates. Especially for you. There's some things here that we can learn. See, David's rise to the throne was really just the next step in his life. As we read about this in the scripture, didn't it strike you? It certainly struck me that it was very underwhelming the way that it's written. I mean, there wasn't a big parade. There wasn't a big, coronation ceremony. There wasn't a big to-do about this. The royal wedding yesterday was a much bigger to-do than what happened with David, and he was being crowned as a king. Basically, just some people came down and said, you know what? We're tired of all this nonsense. Let's just make you the king, and let's move on. That's basically the way that it went. It's kind of anticlimactic the way that this happened. But that's the thing, is that his rise to the throne was really just his next step in life. He had many steps along the way, some where he stepped wisely, and others where he stepped very foolishly. And he had more steps to take after this. And again, some of those he stepped wisely, and some of those he stepped very foolishly. This was not an ending for David. This is not the end of the story when he became king. This is really just the beginning. And for you graduates, it's the same thing. This is not an end, this is a beginning. It's just the next step in your life. It's an important one. It's a very important one. But it's just the next step. You've had lots of steps before this, and you're going to have lots of steps after this one. But this is where you are right now. This is where you are. And the way that you deal with this step is going to have an impact on all of your future steps. This is going to have an impact on your future. And the first thing that we need to learn from David is that we need to learn, don't walk away from God. Don't walk away from God. Despite all the things that God did in and for and through David, and he did a lot. When things got tough, what did David do? He walked away. He walked away. Walked away from God, went to the pagan Philistines. He knew better, but he did it anyway, even though he knew better. Scripture tells us that he lived among the Philistines for 16 months. And during that time, some of the things he did, this is a great list of things that I would highly suggest you not get on your resume for your next job appointment. He lied, he killed, and he pillaged. These were the kind of things that he did while he was among the Philistines. He went out and he did all these kind of things. And until his family was stolen by the Amalekites, it never even mentions one time that he ever talked to God. Not one time. And yet this is the man that's supposed to be the man after God's own heart, right? Not one time did he talk to God in 16 months at least that we know of. As you take this next step, don't follow the example of David that unfortunately many people do. In these kind of times of transition, especially as you're moving into adulthood, we have a tendency to start putting everything before God. We have a tendency to start doing that kind of thing. It may not be intentional, It may not be a premeditated walking away, but it happens far too often for us to ignore the tendency. It happens far too often. And I'm not going to quote you statistics or anything like that, because you are not a statistic. You're a person, and you have a will, and you are going to do what your will drives you to do. That's what you're going to do. In case you're wondering, whatever it is your will drives you to do, that's what you're going to do. So you need to make sure that your will drives you towards God instead of away from God. Drives you into His arms instead of away from Him as you take this next step in life. Look at this in Psalm 32. Be not like a horse or a mule, okay, without understanding, which must be curbed with bit and bridle, or it may not stay near you. Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts in the Lord. I love that passage. Don't be like a mule. In other words, don't be dumb. That's basically what it's saying. Don't be dumb. Learn from the mistakes of people around you. Learn from the mistakes of people like David and others that have gone before you. Learn from those kind of things. Learn that walking away from God brings nothing but sorrow and pain. You talk to people who have walked away from God for a time and come back, and that's all they can talk about is the sorrow and the pain, the difficulty, the loneliness. Don't learn the lesson the hard way, like so many who have gone before. Instead, let the steadfast love of God surround you as you put your trust in Him. Let God's love surround you. Let God's love protect you. Let God's love lead you as you put your trust in Him. But then the next thing we can learn from this is that we need to pray about our next steps. Pray about those next steps. This is the step you're taking now. But there's going to be another step you're going to take tomorrow and the day after and the day after. There's going to be more decisions to make, more steps to take. Except for this time, except for his time among the Philistines, David was always talking to God about his next steps. Except for that period of time where he kind of went away, where he walked away, he was always talking to God about what his next steps should be. At least on 3 occasions in the scripture that we just covered, at least on 3 occasions, David was calling out to God for wisdom and direction. And we need to do the same. We need to call out to God for wisdom and direction. Too often, unfortunately, we treat prayer kind of as a last resort. Kind of when nothing else is working out, when nothing else seems to be working or clicking, and all of our options are gone. Kind of like David when he was there with the Philistines, when everybody had walked away from him, then he turned to God. That's our tendency, is to treat prayer as a last resort. Something to do when there's nothing else you can do. And truthfully, that is a good time to pray. If you find yourself in that point, if you find yourself in that place, absolutely turn to God. Don't sit back and say, well, God's not going to listen to me. God doesn't care about me. I'm in this place. I've done this to myself. I just need to suffer here for a while. Don't put that on yourself. If God's going to leave you somewhere for a while, let God make that decision. You turn to Him. But how much better is it, instead of turning to God at that last moment, how much better would it be to pray before things go bad? So that God can guide us in the way that is best for us. Because that's the plan that He has for you, is the best plan. How many missteps could be avoided if we would just turn to God in prayer and listen for His leading? How many of those missteps could we circumvent? Could we get around? James 1, 5-6 says this. It says, if any of you lacks wisdom, does that apply to anybody here? Applies to me. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. but let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. You know, it takes a little bit of wisdom to ask for wisdom, but not a lot. We should know what we don't know. We should know that we don't know. Each of us should realize that no matter what plans we may have, that above everything else, you and I, whatever else we know, we don't know the future. But God does. We don't know what the future is. We think we know. We have plans for it, but we don't know. But God does. God knows the future. So don't be like a wave, like the scripture says, that's driven, tossed around by the wind. Don't be like a wave. Instead, be like a current. A current that runs under the waves, that's guided by the hand of God. Guided by the hand of God as you put your trust in Him. The third thing that we can learn from this is when you take a next step to take care of business. Take care of business. Any Elvis fans out there? Okay, a few. Elvis, that was Elvis's motto. TCB with the lightning bolt. Take care of business. Thank you very much. I don't know that Elvis is the example we want to follow here, but that was his motto. And that really needs to be our motto. When David took his next step of becoming king, what did he do? He took care of some business. He took care of a couple of things right away. Some big ticket items that he had to take care of. First thing he did was he took Jerusalem and made it his capital city. And second, he defeated the Philistines and ran them back out of Israel's territory. Now, these are both important in their own ways. And for us, we kind of think, well, we don't have a lot of reference points here. We don't know a lot about the situation here, so why is this such a big deal? Well, taking Jerusalem was important because even though it had been promised to them, it was part of the promised land. When the nation of Israel came out of Egypt, Jerusalem was a city inside the territory that they were promised by God, and they were supposed to have this city. But they had never kicked the Jebusites out. They had been there for hundreds of years. They had been living there. They were never removed from the city. So this house cleaning was really necessary to truly establish the kingdom of Israel. So David took that and checked it off the list. All right, we got Jerusalem. We got to take care of that. The defeat of the Philistines was important not only because, as kind of Israel's chief enemy at the time, that they need to be pushed back and they need to be pushed out of the land of Israel, out of their territory, but also since David had run to them during his hard time, since he had run to them, they needed to understand that David had no loyalty to them. That even though he had run to them in the first place, that he had no loyalty to them, but only to God and only to the nation of Israel, and that he had no loyalty to these Philistines. And so he ran them out. So graduates, as you take this next step, you need to take care of some business too. There's some business you need to take care of. Not just the business of starting, this new chapter in either your education or your career. It's not that, but that is important. But you need to take some steps in your commitment to God in all things. Are there people? Are there habits? Are there beliefs? Are there activities in your life right now that pull you away from God? And that question goes for all of us. Are there things in your life that you know, if you're honest with yourself, these things pull me away from God? Are there things in your life that need to be put in their proper place? Are there some things in your life that maybe are good, but maybe they're too important? Maybe they're taking a spot in your life that's above God. And maybe they need to be put back in their proper place. Or again, even removed from your life altogether. Are there some things in your life? Because as you take this next step, this is a perfect opportunity for you. This is, in many ways, a new beginning. Many of you are moving to another place. You're going to be around different people. You're going to be around different things. Your world is going to be opened up. This is a perfect opportunity to put some things in their proper perspective. The things that you think are really important right now, the things that have been important throughout your life to this point, at some point you're going to realize, you know what? Those things really aren't that big of a deal. There's some things that need to be put in proper perspective. But it's also a perfect opportunity to take a stand against some ungodly influences in your life. And we all have them. Your parents have got them. Your grandparents have got them. Your preachers got them. We all have ungodly influences in our lives, and we need to get rid of them. It's time to take a stand against those. And it's also a perfect opportunity to recommit yourself to Jesus and to His leading in your life. To recommit if you've already committed. But if you're at a point in your life where you've never put your faith in Jesus, where you can honestly say, you know what, I don't know that I've ever made a conscious decision to follow Jesus, to trust Him, to accept His forgiveness, to accept that gift that God gives us of grace and mercy, of forgiveness of sins, because Jesus died on the cross to take away my sins. I've never really embraced that. I've never accepted that. Then your step is to put your faith in Him, to commit to Him for the first time. But listen to what 1 Peter 1 says. It says, therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as He who has called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Holiness doesn't sound like a very attainable goal, does it? Holiness. I mean, when you just think about that, do you consider yourself holy? More than likely you don't. But holiness is the business of followers of Jesus. It is what we are called to. We shouldn't back away from it, and we shouldn't back away from calling people to holiness. Because that's what holiness is being set apart to God. It doesn't mean perfect. Not for us, it doesn't. For God, it means perfect. That's all wrapped up in that. But for us, it means to follow after Him with everything that we've got. To be set apart for Him. See, God's working in our lives to make us like Jesus. He's constantly at work on our holiness in our lives, and we need to be working with Him and not against Him. Because that's the only two ways it can be. You can't be neutral in this. You're either working with God or you're working against Him. And like it says, we need to be ridding ourselves of our former ignorance. We think that's what school is for, to rid ourselves of ignorance. But that's what God does in our lives, is to rid ourselves of the ignorant things that we do so that we can be holy, so we can be on the right page with God. There's always going to be next steps. There's always going to be next steps. We may try to stop them from happening, but life does not stop. It keeps moving, and so do we. So, we need to learn from the example of Scripture. We need to learn from this example of David to don't walk away from God. When things get tough, or even when things are good, to don't walk away from God and then to pray about our next steps. Turn to God for those things. Don't be ashamed or afraid or feel weird about it. God wants to hear from us, and then when we take that step, we need to be about the business of following Jesus. As we take that step, after we take that step, as we take the next step. Be about the business of following Jesus. Make that your commitment. Would you join me in prayer?